Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 8.4 on Conjunctive Syllogisms. This is the last new unit, or new section, of Chapter 8, so it will conclude our discussion of compound syllogisms. We'll begin, as we always do, with a recap of where we've been up to this point in the chapter, and then I'll introduce the conjunctive syllogism, the third of the three compound syllogisms we've learned about in this chapter. I'll tell you about the right way to do it, the valid mood, ponendo tollens, and then we'll talk about how not to do it, the invalid mood, tollendo ponens, or at least that's usually not the way to do it. We'll talk about a special case of formally perfect conjunctions, and then conclude with some comparisons between conjunctive syllogisms and disjunctive syllogisms. And what we're going to see is that they're essentially mirror images of each other. So a lot of the things that we discussed today will seem very, very familiar. Not the same, different. In fact, almost the opposite, but mirror images. So there's a lot of similarity there. Okay, let's get started. We've been learning about compound syllogisms, which all begin with compound propositions. In the compound syllogism, we go beyond just having categoricals. Instead, we have more complicated statements like if then, or either or not both and, or things like that. We've learned about two kinds of conditional syllogisms. The conditionals are the ones that use the if then. And the two kinds that we've learned about are the mixed conditional, which mixes that one if then premise with categorical premises after that, and the pure conditional syllogism, which uses all three conditional propositions, both premises and the conclusion. Whether we're doing mixed or pure, the valid moods are modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus ponens proceeds by affirming, and it moves from the front of the conditional to the back of the conditional, right? So if we start with if P then Q, we're going to affirm P in order to affirm Q. Modus tollens, also valid, works by way of negation. But when you work by way of negation, you have to start at the back of the conditional and work toward the front. So you negate Q to negate P. Also completely valid. Even though it works backwards and even though it works negatively, that's also valid. Modus ponens and modus tollens, totally valid. The invalid moods are when you mix them up. If you affirm the consequent, that is, if you're trying to work by affirmation, but you start at the back and you affirm the consequent instead of the antecedent, that's invalid. That's a fallacy. Or if you deny the antecedent, you're trying to work negatively, but you start at the front instead of starting at the back. You deny P in order to deny Q. That's also invalid. You can't do those things. So there's four different things that you can do with the conditional. Two of them valid, two of them not valid. We've also learned about disjunctive syllogisms. That's the second big type of syllogism that we've learned about in this chapter. And those are the ones that use either or logic. There's only really two moods to worry about there. Either you're going to deny one in order to affirm the other, that's tollendo ponens, or you're going to affirm one in order to deny the other. That's ponendo tollens, right? And normally the valid mood is tollendo ponens. You've got something that says either P or Q, either A or B. Well, if you can rule out one of them, you know the other one must be true because your statement told you that one of them would be true. So if you can take one away and leave only one that could be the true one, that's your winner. It's usually invalid to work the other way with ponendo tollens, but did I say valid? It's usually invalid to work the other way with ponendo tollens, but ponendo tollens is also valid if the disjunction is exclusive. What do we mean by exclusive? We mean that it excludes the possibility that both could be true. If you can exclude that possibility, then ponendo tollens works just as well. How do you do that? Well, there are four things that we look for. We look for if P and Q are contradictories, such that if one is true, the other one must be false. Then they can't both be true. If P and Q, if P is a simple negation of Q, for example, P is it is raining and Q is it is not raining. Well, in that situation, if one is true, the other one is false. They can't both be true. What if they're mutually exclusive, like dead and alive, with our example with Jimmy Hoffa? That makes it exclusive. Or what if there is some explicit statement that you can't have both, that both things can't be true? If that's made clear explicitly in the premise, then obviously that's going to be exclusive. Okay, so that's what we've learned about conditional syllogisms and disjunctive syllogisms. Time to talk about the conjunctive syllogism, which I think will seem very familiar. In this definition, every single word, except the words in red, is identical with the definition for the disjunctive syllogism. Right? So obviously the words conjunctive that are here in red, in the disjunctive definition, they say disjunctive. And the word conjuncts that is in the final line, that would be alternans if we were in the disjunctive syllogism definition. The only other thing that's in here is that the word negated. So a conjunctive proposition would simply be one that unites or conjoins two different categorical propositions. However, what we find is that with the conjunctive syllogism, only the negated conjunctive statements are useful. So we don't start with statements that say both. We start with statements that say not both. You can't have both, because that's what helps us to set up the inference. But other than that, this is just exactly the same thing as what we do with disjunction. So here's an example. We can't both hike and water ski this afternoon. We're hiking, so we can't water ski. If we wanted to write that symbolically, we might say not both P and Q, where P is we can hike and Q is we can water ski. P, we're hiking, therefore not Q, not we can water ski. And this works because the major premise tells us that at least one of the conjuncts is false. That is, the premise says not both of those things. And if it seems odd to you that the logic of the whole argument is actually set forth in a premise, if that seems to you like it blurs the line between truth and validity, well, it's actually been going on all through the chapter. This is what happens with all compound syllogisms. The premise, the major premise of the syllogism, sets forth the logical conditions that you're going to use later when you make the inference. But so we treat that as true in the same way that we treat all premises as true when we evaluate validity. If it's not true that you can't both hike and water ski, and we can imagine kids and parents may be arguing about whether it's possible to do both. Yeah, I know we're hiking, but if we run, we can get to the lake, we can get there by 4:30, and there's, kids and parents could be arguing about that. But we take for granted, when we evaluate the validity of the whole argument, that this premise saying that you can't do both is true. And well, if that's the case, then we know that one of these things has to be false. If it's not P, it's got to be Q. And if it's not Q, it's got to be P. As with the disjunctive, it really doesn't matter which one you affirm first, whether you affirm P to negate Q or whether you affirm Q to negate P. Either way, the logic is the same. And what is that logic? Well, it's ponendo tollens. Whenever you affirm one conjunct in order to deny the other, you're using ponendo tollens. Again, the Latin names, we use the affirmative name first, the affirmative word, the affirmative Latin word, before the negative Latin word, because we are first affirming and then negating. It follows the order of our premises. But note also that it works the same way no matter which conjunct you affirm. That is, these two things are exactly the same. If I say not both P and Q, P, therefore not Q, that's the same as not both P and Q, Q, therefore not P. And by the same as, what I mean is that both of those are valid. It's valid no matter which conjunct you affirm first. The logic works exactly the same way. So, while we have 4 cases to worry about with conditional syllogisms, we really only have 2 to worry about with disjunctive and conjunctive. All right, so ponendo tollens, which is normally invalid for disjunctives, turns out to be the one that's always valid for the conjunctives. Interesting. What is the invalid mood? Well, the normally invalid mood is tollendo ponens, the one where you negate first in order to affirm the other one, right? So, for example, you can't both stay awake all night and be alert in class. You did not stay awake all night, so you will be alert in class. If we write that symbolically, it looks like this: not both P and Q, where P is awake all night and Q is alert in class. Not P, not awake all night, therefore Q, alert in class. Well, we all know this is false because there are lots of reasons not to be alert in class, even if you weren't awake all night. People are failing to be alert in class all the time, even though they got a good night's sleep. We don't need to say any more probably about the reasons for that. But we know that the logic here doesn't work. This is tollendo ponens because we're denying one conjunct in order to affirm the other. But this is invalid for ordinary conjunctive syllogisms because we ordinarily understand negated conjunctive propositions, like not both, to mean not both and potentially not either one. So this seems a little bit like our normal understanding of disjunctions as inclusive rather than exclusive. We normally think that either or, either P or Q, means that at least one of those is true and both of them might be. Here again, the mirror image. We're saying that normally we'll say that they can't both be true, and it might be that neither one of them is true. That's the normal understanding of a negated conjunction. Well, there is an exception, just as there is with disjunctions, and the exception is the formally perfect conjunction. I have to sort of apologize for the name because I hate it, but I didn't make it up. There's something very, very intuitive to me about calling something an exclusive disjunction. It makes a lot of sense. There is, to me, nothing intuitive about the name formally perfect conjunction. I don't know what's supposed to be formally perfect about it. But here's the definition anyway. The formally perfect conjunction is a conjunctive proposition in which necessarily only one conjunct can be false. For example, you can't take both chem and bio next year, but you must take one. In other words, not both, but at least one. In a formally perfect disjunctive syllogism, both ponendo tollens and tollendo ponens are valid. In other words, when it's not both and at least one, you can't go wrong. This should ring a bell. It should remind you of the exclusive disjunction, a disjunctive proposition in which necessarily only one alternate can be true. So the formally perfect conjunction, only one conjunct can be false. In the exclusive disjunction, only one alternate can be true. Again, mirror images of the same thing. And in our example here about chem and bio, I can phrase the exclusive disjunction this way. You must take either chem or bio next year, but you can't take both. Does it matter how I say this, whether I say it the first way or the second way? Not a bit. In other words, really what we have happening here with the formally perfect conjunction is logically entirely equivalent to the exclusive disjunction. These two forms have essentially met in the middle. Each one of these options that I've given in quotes includes the element of not both, and each one includes the element of at least one. They simply vary in the order in which these things are included in the statement. Conjunctions are formally perfect. Again, I apologize for the name. It doesn't make any sense to me either. Conjunctions are formally perfect under the same circumstances in which disjunctions are exclusive. That is, we look to see whether P and Q are contradictories, or whether P is a pure negation of Q, or whether maybe not P and not Q are mutually exclusive for some other reason. If for alive and dead, or maybe not alive and not dead. And then finally, when the exclusivity is explicit, like you can't wear both a cummerbund and a waistcoat with a tuxedo, but you must wear one or the other. In that case, then we know that at least one of those things has to be worn. And for that, then, excuse me, for that, then we will be able to use either tollendo ponens or ponendo tollens. So now let's compare these two different kinds of compound syllogism. For the disjunctive syllogism, there are only two ways to do it. There's ponendo tollens and there's tollendo ponens. And ponendo tollens is normally invalid unless it's exclusive. The way you want to do it for the disjunctive is tollendo ponens. That's valid all the time for disjunctives. But meanwhile, over on the conjunctive side, the exact same format, but except for the use of a conjunctive major premise, is going to mean that ponendo tollens, valid for all, but tollendo ponens, normally invalid unless you've got something that is formally perfect. So mirror images here. Maybe another way of looking at it is here, that each one of these has one mood that's always valid. For disjunctives, it's tollendo ponens. For conjunctives, it's ponendo tollens. And then the other one is normally invalid. The other mood is normally invalid for each one of these, but there is an exception, a special case that makes all four or both moods valid if you're in the special case. And the special cases, as we've seen, are actually the same thing. So basically, two sides of the same coin for conjunctive syllogisms, basically the same thing as disjunctions. All right, that'll wrap up Chapter 8, and I'll be back later with Chapter 9.